Hello everyone, Master Xeon1001 here, and in this incremental update of boxcutter 718.6, we'll be talking about some improvements and changes that have happened with Simple Pi, Grid Cut, Repeat, Wedge, Dot, Auto Depth, and some behavioral adjustments that should add for a better quality of life experience overall for users, as well as a short demo at the end just demonstrating how this asset shown on screen was put together. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in and go over boxcutter 718.6. Whenever you first enable boxcutter, you'll see the D pi after pressing the D key, which is our initial pi that attempts to hold all the options that boxcutter has to offer within one easy pi. However, over time we've realized that maybe a pi doesn't have to have so many options, so we've attempted to streamline this by creating a new pi called a Simple Pi. You can enable it under the behavior sprocket under display and Simple Pi, and once enabled we can see that there's now a simpler pi. For this update we've added support for grid, which was omitted from the last release by accident. So basically if you're in box, you can now quickly jump over to grid and just begin cutting a grid. However, in my case I want to press T and adjust the thickness because it's out of control. And now I can just click and apply. I can also press D and jump over to Wedge if I want. I can also turn off grid because I'm using Wedge, and now I'm able to bring down a wedge relatively easy. I can press D, click on box, and we'll see that by choosing the same shape that you're already on, it'll actually reset the status of the shape. So let's say that we were both in grid and wedge in box right now. Well, we could actually just click on box and we see that it actually resets us back to a box state, allowing us to get back to work in a really quick fashion. So you can just quickly just jump to grid if you need it, use a grid, perform your cut, press D, press 1, jump back to box, and you're able to continue working. And this is the same thing across all of the tools. So basically if you're an Ngon, regular Ngon allows you to draw like this. However, if we were to turn off cyclic, we see that we're now able to draw a line. And because it's a line, that means we could press T in order to adjust its thickness for whatever level we want our thickness to be. And then of course drag the extrusion dot to extrude and click to apply. But if we want to reset it back to just classic Ngon, we could just press D, click on 2, and we're back to just classic Ngon, allowing us to get back to work without having to go through a lot of options or menus and getting back to work all the much faster. Grid was added to boxcutter as of the last update. However, in this update we aim to improve it and add support for single axial support. So if we were to just draw a box, press tab and pause it, we could bring down the shape drop down and turn this box into a grid. And if we just lower all of the segments to 0 on one of these axes, we are now able to cut on this using single axis support. So let's just draw another grid, and we will just press tab and pause it while it's in a 2D state. And let's actually change this to 0 and add all of our segments to the y-axis. So there's been some differences as well when it comes to the transition between grid and box as well. So if you use the hotkey of Shift G, we are able to scroll and adjust the amount of segments happening in our grid. However, we can also press Shift G in this state and switch back to box, which will actually remove solidification, which was a small oversight of the last release. So let's just bring our shape out, bring it back, and we are able to now begin extruding. However, anytime we could always press Shift G, turn this back into a grid, which will auto solidify, allowing us to see this cut the way it's supposed to be, because without solidification it would just be a disaster. And then of course we're able to just click and apply. To show another example of why one would need to use boxcutter in order to perform a dice, we have this object that's at an angle, and of course we could just roll and add a bunch of edge loops in it, but let's say that there were Ngons in the surface and that wasn't actually possible. We could select this face, control click align in order to align to this area, and now we can actually just draw out a grid. We could press T to adjust our solidification, we could press T to remove solidification, tab to pause it, Control D for the mini helper, which is one of my favorite ways to adjust things on the fly, where we can get in and adjust our settings. Let's actually jump this over to knife, We got to remove our solidification again, but now after applying, we've basically diced through this object from this particular view. So there's a lot of reasons as to why one would want to be able to perform dicing with boxcutter using view align parameters, such as the one that was shown. However, there are more advanced cases that this was definitely born for. So here we are looking at a bug bot, and we'll just press D and choose box to reset out of grid. And using snap dots, we will just begin drawing a shape coming out of the surface. So here we are drawing our first shape, and we can now just double click to repeat all the way around, which was one of the things that was added as of the last update. However, one of the issues we came across was that we did not have the ability to track depth. And so as of now, we now have that capability also within boxcutter. To show that in action, I'm just going to draw a circle, and we will just tap and bring it out oh so far. And let's just select our shape and repeat that. Let's try that again. Double click, control and double click, and here we see that we're now able to repeat all of these circles to the exact same depth that we used for the shape that we are referencing from. So this was just a small oversight with repeat. I'm just happy to see that now repeat has gone even further than it could before, allowing us to now repeat tracking to the depth. When it comes to wedge, while you're in any shape, you can just use the shape drop down and just convert it to wedge by just checking the wedge box. Right now we're using boxcutter 718.3, which is an older release, but in order to show where we've gone with wedge, it's important to go back to the past for a moment. So I've drawn this wedge and I've tabbed it to pause. And every time you move the draw dot, if you bring it in too much, the wedge will do this sort of auto calculation that would kind of disrupt the wedge that you have. So as a result, I would always have to press S and Y in order to scale it on the correct axis, like you're seeing me do here, in order to get a smaller wedge. But anytime I would try to adjust the draw dot, the wedge would manipulate, which was something that would drive me crazy. Most of the time I would just use wedge like you see me doing here, where I just draw the wedge and just call it a day. However, let's create something a little more advanced with our wedge. So in order to exit wedge, I'll just press W. And we could press B and add a bevel, press spacebar and press 1, and we'll select the active object and perform another cut. And with this interesting cut, we'll just draw a box around it, and we'll press Y in order to change this to an extraction, and clicking, we now have the extraction. We're now in custom cutter. So if we draw a custom cut, we can see that we're just placing it on the surface, and we're able to rotate it using R. We're able to drop it and extrude it to 1:1 holding shift. We can also press W and wedge it. In fact, pressing W multiple times will allow you to change the type of wedge that you're receiving. However, pressing shift tilde will rotate the shape and the wedge at the same time, and this is actually undesired and was something that we needed to rectify over the course of the next releases. So that's where this latest update comes in, is improving the behavior with using the draw dot with wedge, and also improving the ability to rotate the shape inside independent of the wedge. So if we just minimize Blender, we're now over in the present 718.6, and we're still on box. And with our hotkeys showing, if we just draw a box, we see that the hotkey of W allows us to quickly change this to a wedge. And if we pause this, we can now grab the drag dot or drag the draw dot, and we're able to now adjust the wedge without it actually doing any sort of flipping action, which was just undesired. It was a bit of an overstretch. Sometimes we try to make things smart and they work against us. This is one of those cases. Another thing that was also resolved was the ability to have it rotate inside. So let's just create the same custom cutter as before. This one's like a kind of test shape I always experiment with as a custom cutter. And now that we've brought this out, we can just draw a shape around it. Press Y to extract, and we've extracted it. And let's just draw our shape holding shift, and we'll just bring that out, bring it over to the side, and let's just press W to wedge it. And now when we press shift tilde, we see that the shape is rotating inside, but the wedge is actually remaining perfectly static. And this is because we need to deal with the wedge axis independently of rotate inside, which is delegated to either shift tilde or shift R if you're not a tilde using user but this is a massive improvement for Wedge and Rotate Inside. Rotate Inside was supposed to not get confused and tied up with Wedge, and every time I saw it, it just made me feel bad. But now I'm happy to announce that Wedge and Custom Cutter now behave properly as far as Rotate Inside is concerned. And when it comes to Wedge and dealing with this axis, we'll be adding fine options for that in an upcoming update. But for now, you can just press W in order to cycle the wedge. And then if you're needing to actually rotate to a different side, you can actually just rotate it and still use Shift tilde to rotate inside. So we now have that independent control back. We just need to get it implemented for Wedge as well. Something that I find myself doing more often than usual is a cut like this, where I'll be looking at something from an angle and I'll perform my cut, and then I'll jump over to circle, and using snap dots, I will just begin extruding a circle upwards. And then I'll go back and look at it in side view, and I'll grab the dot and adjust it, and then grab the draw dot and also adjust that. And we see that grabbing the draw dot just isn't going to work in this particular view. If we rotate our view, we see that we're able to grab the draw dot for the circle radius and adjust it as desired. However, if we're looking at it from a flat axial, we're not able to do so. In fact, I'm dragging and moving the circle, and we see that we're not able to adjust it. We're able to adjust the extrusion and the offset, and we could even add a bevel. Just had to make sure. But we're not able to adjust the draw dot. So this was something that we also sought to resolve in this update, but it was a little bit more complicated of an issue than initially expected, so it required a fix for it to fix. But I'm happy to announce that now that situation is resolved. So we performed our box cut, and now we're just bringing up our circle, and if we look at it from the side, we're able to bring this dot down. We're able to now grab our draw dot and adjust our radius. Just a small oversight, but all these things together help make boxcutter a more fluid and user-friendly experience. But it's definitely one of those things we didn't want to leave out on. So I'm happy to announce that now you can use the draw dot in perpendicular flat views in a way that you couldn't previous. So a general box cutter use is you click and drag to create your 2D shape, and then you let go and begin performing your extrusion, and that's generally the way that box cutter is meant to be used. However, we wanted to play with that formula a few releases ago, and so we added the ability for users to specify a specific laser cut depth, but also this option for auto depth. When auto depth is enabled, it actually removes the secondary step of dictating the extrude by calculating it based on the width of the first line that you're drawing. So basically this allows you to create box cuts super fast without even having to worry about the extrusion depth. And auto depth is great and all. However, when enabled with dots and we attempt to use it, it would for some reason bring up this release lock panel, which while you're able to still work, is just weird. In fact, here it is again. I just use dots and it brings up this release lock panel where I have to pause, move the mouse away, and there's no reason why the release lock panel should be showing up while you're using dots. For the record, the release lock panel is located by shift clicking the release lock option, where you can choose release lock, where basically after you draw your stroke, it frees your mouse in order to move around. Release lock, which enables laser cut in order to freeze it right before the laser cut operation. And then there's repeat lock, which will freeze repeat, allowing you to make adjustments to repeat previous to apply, and then quick execute, which will just bypass as many steps as possible, allowing you to work in a very rapid manner. But there's no reason whatsoever for that to be popping up like you're seeing here. So this is something that we wanted to remove as a bug and improve with this latest update. So if we bring up the latest box cutter, we can go under our shape panel and just enable auto depth, and let's just press D and switch over to box, and now we are working with auto depth. You know, nothing new here. Spin around for a moment. However, if we hold control and we click, we see that we are able to now work off of dots without having any sort of release lock panel pop up. So I'm not sure why that was there and why it was there so long, but I'm glad that it's now been resolved, resulting in us able to go back to focusing on what we actually want auto depth to do. In the back of my mind, I've been pondering how auto depth could be supporting one-to-one with custom cutter, enabling users to draw custom cutters in a really fast manner, extruding depth by just supporting auto depth off the bat. But that's the story, of course, for another day. One of the longest lasting but irritating bugs of boxcutter is the following. So right now I'm in box using cut, and we'll just draw a box, but we'll press B in order to bevel, and let's just perform our extrusion, leaving it in a pause state. If I were to press S and X, we are now able to scale this on the X axis and we see it distorting. If we press S and Y, we also see it distorting. This is not the way that scaling inside of boxcutter with these modifiers is supposed to behave. So this is one of the longest, oldest bugs that just drove me crazy, and I'm happy to announce that it's been resolved. So if we grab this box and press B to bevel it, we are now able to scale on any axis and will no longer be distorting bevels or any other modifiers that are happening. This is a dramatic improvement and something that just drove me crazy for the longest. So I'm just happy to announce that in-tool scaling will no longer cause distortions when it comes to the bevel. When it comes to boxcutter, whenever you draw a shape and exit, you can choose how long it takes the shape to fade. For example, I can go inside the behavior sprocket under display and set it to something like 1500. And now whenever I perform a cut, it actually takes 1500 milliseconds in order for the shape to leave, which can result in a really aesthetic appearance for whenever you're cutting with boxcutter. It's just something fun to do when you're playing around with it. Sometimes it's fun to just get in and just set a really high fade and just see what happens. However, there are certain numbers that once set to will enable a sound effect. For example, a fade time of 1, 2, 3 will enable a nice crunch sound to play. For the last few releases, sound effects have been impacted by some changes that happened with Blender that I was unaware of, but after being pointed out that it was related to the audio devices, we've now exposed it to users. So if you're using a sound effect with boxcutter, you're now able to choose which audio device is being used. I believe recently they've changed over to Win ASPI, which when used will play a sound effect, but for some reason the sound effect wouldn't play again after it was played the first time. So I'm not sure if that was a bug with that particular device, but changing it to something like OpenAL, which was actually what the sound system was set to previously, you see that you're able to get a sound result every time. So in the event that you are a fan of sounds and you run into this issue, just know that changing your audio device is a surefire way to possibly get you back on track. But we are keeping an eye on it, hoping that it does get resolved in a future update. So boxcutter is an active tool, meaning that you can change to any other active tool or even exit boxcutter by just pressing W and switching back to the select active tool. However, in edit mode, you can also enable boxcutter by pressing Alt W or selecting the active tool. Whenever you're in boxcutter, you can use it slightly different than you would in object mode. Like right now, you can see I'm using edit mode boxcutter, but object mode I'm not using boxcutter. And I can even set up special options inside of edit mode that are different than the options that I have in object mode. So here I'm using destructive boxcutter in edit mode, but in object mode, I'm using non-destructive boxcutter. So it's just two different boxcutters in each hand, both giving me a very different result. However, a user reported that there was an issue with make that was now resolved, allowing users to now use make in edit mode without issue. I'm not sure what caused that, but we're just glad to announce that we finally got that resolved. So if you're using boxcutter in edit mode, like you're seeing me do here, and you're wanting to use make, just know that make is now supported in edit mode the way it's supposed to. So to conclude this video, I figured a demo would be in order. So we'll just take this cube, delete it, Shift A, we'll just place a cylinder. This cylinder has 32 spans on it, which will do for what we're going for. But I'll tab into edit mode, press S, Z 1.5, scale it by 1.5, press D, and we'll jump over to Ngon. And with Ngon active, we'll first press C to jump out of cyclic, don't know why that was on. And after setting our last point, we'll just bevel it. And we'll press Alt X to mirror that to the other side. And so far so good. And in order to mitigate the shading, I always experiment with putting edge loops in to try to smooth things out. And as we can see, just a few edge loops went a long way towards improving the shading that we were getting with this particular area. Next thing we want to do is just grab this top piece and bevel it, and we'll just mark that. In fact, we could just use S sharpen and shift click on sharpen to adjust the auto smooth. And now we have the shape looking fairly good. The next thing we want to do from here is look at this from side view, and we'll just first press D, switch to box, and then hold Control, bring out snap dots, press A for make, and we'll just hit spacebar to just end it, and it did not jump over to the other side. So we'll just tab in edit mode and jump to vertex, and we'll just jump it over ourselves. Doesn't matter if it's 100% accurate, we can actually bring this piece out because we're just going to be mirroring it. We just want a box just encompassing both sides. So I'm just going to grab these three faces, Control I, delete everything else with Control I and just delete. And we'll just grab these two edges and we'll just press Control Shift B. And instead of letting the bevels overshoot, we'll press C and just let those meet. And we'll select these two, just press J. We'll select this, press Control B. And we also want to set our origin because we're about to mirror, but we have our origin set here. So I'm just going to select these 2 points, Shift S, origin to selection. And now my origin is precisely in the center. And we just Q and add a solidification. Also, whenever you're doing this double merge situation with the clamp, you always want to delete the verts or the geometry that meets. It always is going to be a thing. Next thing from here is let's Control A, and we'll just make all the geometry real. And we're just going to hold Control and just click everything in between. EZ, SZ0. And from here, we can just go under Operations, Clean Mesh to clean the mesh. And we'll just resymmetrize it just to put our loops back. And the reason that we clean the mesh is so we don't have any of these loops flowing down, which will mess up what we're about to do next, which is basically QOT, spacebar, choose cylinder, and we'll just roll the cylinder beneath using to shape. And we'll just scale it up a little bit. That's not a good cylinder. Let's try it again, QOT. We'll press E for equalize. And now we have a proper cylinder. Sometimes two shapes just handy for putting a shape precisely below another shape. We'll select both of these and press Q, Union, and Control A, Visual Geometry to Mesh. And this is what we're looking at so far. So let's just resymmetrize everything to get the least amount of edges that are just going out into space. So now we want to force a bevel along this side. So the easiest way to do that is to just use the knife tool, and we'll just knife, symmetrize it to the other side. And we can grab this double edge area, first Control A, Visual Geometry to Mesh. And we also want to apply the scale. And now we can create a bevel flowing just like this. We'll just select each of these edges that aren't needed, dissolve them. And I can just tell you from experience that you always have to do a back merge on this sort of area or else you'll have issues. And let's Alt-X, symmetrize it. And so now we've created kind of our laser, and we've created our base. So the next thing from here is we want to use a vert to jump off and put a circle in between. So I'll select both of these, this side and this side. We'll press J, put a vert in between, and let's just draw, press spacebar, and we've cut all the way across. So let's ever scroll, bring that back, and so far so good. And let's just control click mark in order to put a reverse bevel, and just lowering the auto smooth does the job every time. Now we can just put a mirror modifier on this because now we're aiming for the finale of this. Let's bring back this shape, but in the Q menu we're going to shift click shade solid to make a duplicate of that bowl shape, making it solid. And we want to just mirror that across. So far so good. And we'll put one loop in the middle, but we'll press Control D and just remove it from all vertex groups because it'll interfere with our reverse bevel. And if we snap our cursor there, we can actually select this and origin the cursor. Let's try that again. Actually, I wonder if using the loop in the middle was actually entirely accurate. So let's use reset. Nope, reset's not going to do it for us. Origin to selection, and then we can use reset in object mode. What axis? Oh, it's not even Y. It's I mean, it's not even X. It's Y. Sorry, it's 3:50 in the morning that I'm recording this, so not completely awake. Let's try that again. Let's bring this back. We'll snap our cursor here, and then we'll set our origin here. And it just makes our life easier for making this possible. So we just want our origin in the right place. Sometimes it's just important to get the origin just right. A lot of keystrokes there, but still, mission accomplished. So now we're going to bring out a box, but we're going to turn it into a wedge. But instead, we're going to rotate around 180 degrees. And we can just shift click sharpen to lower to auto smooth. And let's just mirror that to the other side. And so now we've created our base and we've created kind of our laser that we're starting off with. If we want, we can start beveling the bottom base of it as well to just round that out. And just looking at debating on what our next steps are going to be. You know, in the original version that I was testing, I did alt click on subdivision in order to set a subdivision as first in the stack, which allowed me to get a slightly more rounded result, transitioning better with this area. And then I had a weld just to even out some rough edges, but if you scroll it up too high, it'll definitely start eating your lunch, so you want to be careful. At this point, I can also select the shape and just put a bevel. And whenever the bevel comes into play, that's when I find myself increasing my weld, because just a little bit of care with the bevel and its relationship can improve its relationship with the surface. However, we may want to bring back this piece and just do some maintenance on it, origin to geometry, so we can move it over and scale it on both sides. Maybe put a couple of edge loops in here. And we might want to also just bring it in just slightly, just trying to improve its relationship with that particular edge. And then we can, of course, shrink the bevel in the event that we want it to be just a little bit tighter. But just like that, we're now able to continue. So even though there's bevel on this model is now considered a little heavier than expected. So this is what wedge circle looks like whenever you just activate it with the wedge just enabled. However, we can always press D and just go into pie menu, and just by selecting circle, it'll revert back to circle, or we can just uncheck wedge. So there's more than one way to exit the state of a tool whenever you're locked in. We'll press X to keep that. And let's also mark this on the top and put a weighted normal just to fix that shading. I was about to start taking drastic measures, but looks like a little weighted normal will take care of it today. Select this piece, put a reverse bevel, and let's look at this from the front. So we'll press D, switch back over to box. And let's press X. And we see that we probably should have taken this just a little bit deeper. And there's a lot that could be done with improving what's going on with this particular area. However, the easiest might be to just scale it until we find some sort of middle ground. However, before continuing, it's probably important to slice the top off, because things are only going to get spicier from here. Put a couple of weighted normals just to set our base. But if we Alt V, we look at the wireframe, we see that we have a lot of geometry that's interfering with what's going on, which we could actually clean that up by just putting a decimate. And if we just move our decimate up just a little bit, we see that this area is now looking a lot better. And we could do the same thing with this piece as well, just putting a decimate and then moving it up the stack. choosing to decimate it before it gets evaluated by the bevel, resulting in a much cleaner result being given to it. And with that, we can continue. So this piece is probably parented to the base, which also could use a weight normal at this point. Let's just select both of these, Control P, parent them together. Now we can at least rotate it, but in order to do that, we need to select both of these and just uniquify them. So now they at least have unique cutters, and that's because I plan to rotate this 45 degrees over to the other side. And we'll apply rotation, and let's also mirror it to the other side. And the same thing with this. And now we have it going in a four-way kind of mirror as if we were using radial array, but instead we're using mirror. And there's other ways we could have done it. We could have just done a radial array on the cutters and just dealt with 4, but I always like to experiment with different ways of possibly working in hopes of finding a better solution. So even this version of the model is different than the previous versions that I'd prepared. Let's just press W to adjust our wedge, and we see that our wedge is actually upside down. So let's just shift it to live. We'll look at it in top view and really get this wedge to fit into the surface the way it's supposed to be. And let's take a look at what we have with our weld. Our weld is a couple of booleans below. Let's bring it up. And by either lowering or raising it, in this case raising it, we're able to now get this piece to better integrate with the wedge that we added. That was kind of a 2D wedge for a 3D situation, but we managed to make it work. So now we are back to work. So press D, switch over to box. In case you're wondering what shape I'm in, you're always able to see it up here at the top. However, my favorite way to get around through the shapes is just Alt scroll, and you can actually find all the shapes that boxcutter has to offer just by holding Alt and rolling your mouse wheel, which is my favorite way to get around. Let's slice that part off. Let's slice that part off. And let's come into the back, and we can press X to slice it. Let's just press S in hopes of getting it to look just a little bit better, and we'll press spacebar, and now we have this piece. So let's Alt X, mirror that to the other side, select this piece, mirror it to the other side as well. I don't even have to look at the other side because the wire display will show on the other side. It should show on the other side. We should probably make it have an option for see-through. It's supposed to be a display notification system. So for this, I'll hit align to view, where we can just create a couple of view align cuts without having to worry about the surface perpendiculars messing with us. And looking at the clock, I see that we are going to be running out of time here, so I'll speed things up. I should have added a subdivision surface to the cylinder before we did all this stuff to it. So let's say I did want to actually do that. Let's say I did want to do that because if we put a subdivision on it right now, we see that we're going to get a result like that, which means that we have to actually solve everything. We could put a triangulate on it, which will allow us to do it. But in order to actually subdivide the surface, we would need to apply everything. So just to demonstrate that in action, let's just run a sharpen, and we weren't able to catch the exact edges. That's fine. Alright, let's turn off subdivision display for edit mode. It can lie to you, so it's important to turn it off at times where you need to specifically focus on just aspects of the mesh. For this, we'll just merge this at last. Also, that piece isn't needed. You know, some of these triangles just aren't needed. Alright, and we look at this, and this is basically our subdivided version. Of course, the subdivision geometry is super hacked, but it's a more rounded version of what we have here. So because of that, we'll just place this piece there and Shift S, selection to cursor, and let's just continue with that, pretending as if we gave it enough rounding to begin with. So with this selected, let's just put a bevel on it, which is definitely going to push our geometry to the max. But we also want to alt scroll backwards until we also catch that edge, because we are using angle. So let's say we actually was really OCD and we want to get rid of that. Well, I'm going to decimate it, but we got to decimate it before the bevel evaluates it, and it's fine. And now we are able to continue on. In fact, I'm going to dissolve that and select this piece and just shift click on curve extract in order to extract that to a new piece. And let's give that a bevel 2, pressing 1 in order to adjust this auto smooth in the middle of bevel. And this is our shape that we're looking at so far. In fact, using power save, let's call this laser assembly. And I'm hoping that this demo doesn't take any longer than 30 minutes. So let's just select everything and add a blank material. We'll give the base its own blank material that will be shared with the one that was assigned there. Let's give this its own blank material, give this a blank material. We want to give this the same blank material that's being shared there. And with these two, we could just select them and just link their materials instead of scrolling through the list. You might be wondering why I'm not seeing material icons whenever I'm scrolling through, and that's because there's currently an issue in Blender where if you're generating blank materials while you're looking at the material list, they'll just disappear. So I don't know how to explain it, but that's our fix for it in the meantime, is just being able to disable it in preferences. This is what we have so far. So far, so good. We press Ctrl S and really admire our work. However, the loops that are showing up here look a little bit strange. So anytime this sort of thing happens, I will go back and locate the cutter and just put a couple of edge loops. And we see that it looks a lot better by us basically mitigating the shading. Alright, so like Christmas, let's jump over to Look Dev and see what we got with our materials. And that's actually not bad at all. I was hoping that this would have been a little bit brighter of a metal, so I'm going to shift click on material scroll to replace every instance that's actually using that particular material. We'll just scroll through combinations until we find exactly the one that we want, and we could do the same thing with this piece. And we could do the same thing with this piece, just scrolling through combinations until we find absolutely the material that we want for this particular asset. With this piece, let's just control click bevel to just give it a new bevel. And something I like to do whenever I'm messing with things is just bring in a cube for the purposes of just creating an insert, extracting it, and then deleting the asset. So with this, I'll just bring in a circle, Shift T, bring in another one. This time we'll press T in order to give it thickness. Bring in another one. Press B for bevel. Bring in another one. Hold Shift, keep it live. Select the top face, do a reverse bevel. And this is basically the circle that I want to put on that area. So we're just going to draw a box around it. Press Y. And this has been extracted. It's now our custom cutter as it says at the top. We can press X and delete that. And let's just select this piece and just bring in that custom cutter we just created. And we'll just pause it so that way I can grab the extrusion dot, and by using shift while dragging it I can get a one-to-one exact recreation of what I extracted. So now we have this much finer assembly with an interesting detail on it, and if we look at it in Look Dev, we see that we are pretty close to the finish line. So the next thing I want to add is a laser. So I'm just going to bring in a cylinder, S, Shift, and Z in order to scale on everything but Z, and then S and Z to scale on everything, S and Z to scale on Z alone. And so here we're just sharpening it to just get a good looking cylinder. And from here, let's look at it from front view, press U, project from view, and in the UV editor we just want to select everything and just rotate it 90 degrees. And that is it for UV unwrapping for the day. So let's now look at this in our 3D view. We'll jump over to shading. And one of the things about look dev that always drives me crazy is seeing the environment in the background. So let's just turn that off. But it's not through scene world, it's actually through world opacity. So now that we have that off, let's just delete that. And inside of this material, we're going to put an input of a texture coordinate. We'll put an input of a texture of a gradient. And we'll put our UV to our gradient. Let's just view what our gradient looks like, and we see that we get black to white. Shift A, let's bring in our color ramp. And with our color ramp, we could begin sending black up the pipe, or worrying about how much white is making it down. So about something like that will suffice. And from here, we can use a shader of a transparent, shader of a mix, a shader of an emission. Really basic node setup here. And we'll just plug the gradient into the factor and plug the shader into the result. And now we should be able to see the result. However, for this particular material, we'll need to change our blend mode to be alpha blend and maybe enable screen space refractions. I don't think it's needed, but I always click it anyways. And now we can actually see our material coming to life in the 3D view with the transparency. So right now it's just a white emissive. However, let's change this to be red. And let's just up our brightness. And in order to see how bright it really is, let's press Alt VV. We'll press V to get rid of the viewport display, but we'll press Q to enable bloom for look dev. And from here, we can just begin toying with our settings, and we see that using linear isn't going to cut it, so we'll need B-spline in order to get something a little more graceful. And we'll click plus, add an additional tick, but we'll make this new tick white and put it all the way at the end. And this just gives us a nicer transition in between. So now we have this laser assembly. And the best part is we can just grab this piece and rotate it, and everything rotates with it. However, we need to put this into the parenting party. So selecting this piece and any of these pieces will do really. And we'll press Control P, Object Keep Transform. And now we have our laser assembly. And so we were able to wrap that up pretty quick in this particular video. I just wanted to do something just at the end to just kind of show something you could be doing with boxcutter or Blender in general, just having some fun. You know, I've just been making these laser assemblies as a way to kind of wake up in the morning. However, you know, my curse is always going to be with wanting to tweak things until the living end. So with this piece, you know, it'd be cool is if we enabled our ability to see things and we went to view align and D box. Let's just take that piece out via box, press X, spacebar, and because I was able to cut it from view, I can see that it's not a very deeply cut shape. And we'll just give it a blank material. It doesn't really matter what we do because I want to make this a red material with no metallicity, but very shiny. And when we look at it in the render, that's what we are looking at. And if we use Everscroll to recall it, we can actually make this little piece of red trim even smaller. And let's just continue on with our red trim. We'll just cut this slice off, put a piece of red trim there. And so far so good. Let's also press Q, and we're not able to recall the cutter because the cutter is no longer a thing. So let's just jump over to this cutters collection and shift click on shade solid to make a solid duplicate for reasons that I no longer remember. Let's hide that piece, get rid of the camera and light. They're not my camera and light. And this piece, its only purpose is to be in between and also to be very red. You know, really simple geometry. I could have two shaped and put that there instead, but instead I wanted to duplicate the cutter. And so now we rotate our shape and just take a look at our laser assembly that we've created here. And voila, that is a wrap. So with that, I will wrap this video up, and I'll see you guys next time.